Close your eyes for a moment. Visualize a symbol that has withstood the erosion of centuries, that has survived the fall of empires, conquests, and revolutions, and that today still stands, motionless and proud, in the center of a national flag. The image is simple in its elements, but profound in its meaning. A golden eagle perched on a nopal cactus. Its wings are not open for flight, but rather folded, in a pose of possession, of rest finally found. In its talons, a serpent writhes, not as fleeing prey, but as a symbol of a challenge overcome. But this image, so ubiquitous today, was not born as a political emblem decreed in an office. Its origin is much older, much more visceral. It was born as a promise, like the last piece of a divine puzzle. Long before a monumental city shone upon the salty waters of the Valley of Mexico, before its gigantic temples touched the sky, before its markets teemed with the languages of an entire continent, there was only a people in motion, a wandering people, a people without a homeland. According to Mexica oral tradition, centuries of pilgrimage had begun by divine order. Their ancestors, guided by the relentless voice of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the rising sun, had a mission. They were to walk, to cross deserts where the sun cracks the skin, to climb mountains where the air becomes thin, to circumvent immense lakes until they found a sign. The prophecy did not promise a land already fertile, with generous rivers. It did not promise an abandoned city ready to be occupied. The promise was stranger, more challenging. It was a geographical enigma. They were to found their home, the center of their world, in the exact spot where they saw an eagle perched on a nopal cactus sprouting from a crack in the rock. And all this in the middle of the water. It seemed absurd, a contradiction of nature. Cacti don't grow on rocks in the middle of lakes. But for generations, while burying their dead in strange lands and watching their children born under unknown skies, that people walked, nourished by this belief. They didn't yet know that when their eyes finally beheld that improbable scene, they would be about to plant the seed of one of the most extraordinary cities humanity has ever seen. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we need to go back in time. The Mexica, the people the world would later know as the Aztecs, did not emerge as an empire. Their origin is humble, that of refugees. Their story begins in Aztlán, a mythical place shrouded in mist and legends. The accounts depicted in ancient codices say that Aztlán was an island, or perhaps a region to the north from where they came. There, they lived under the protection of their gods for a long time, but something broke. The voice of Huitzilopochtli commanded their departure. There was no choice. The god not only guided them, he carried them in a sacred urn. He was the center of the procession, the reason for the journey. Thus began a migration that would drag on for centuries. It was not a triumphal march. It was a slow and painful diaspora. Men, women, and children, carrying their few belongings, their seeds, and their gods, crossed hostile landscapes. Each generation was born already knowing that it was part of something greater, of an endless journey. The children listened around the campfires, the stories of the promised sign, the eagle, the cactus, the stone. The old died hoping that the younger ones would see what they did not see. The path was relentless. Groups separated. Some decided to stay behind, founding villages along the route. But the hardcore, the devotees of Huitzilopochtli, continued. They crossed scorching deserts like the Sonora, traversed valleys, and finally sighted what they attracted them like a magnet, the Great Valley of Mexico, with its system of shimmering lakes surrounded by snow-capped mountains and volcanoes. For a people who only knew the desert, that vision must have been like arriving in paradise. But paradise, they would discover, already had owners. The Valley of Mexico in the 13th century was not an empty place. Its borders were disputed by powerful city-states that had inherited the sophistication of previous civilizations like the Toltec. Culhuacan, Azcapotzalco were names that commanded respect. And for these established peoples, the newly arrived Mexica were everything they didn't want. They were foreigners, speakers of a strange dialect. They were rude, coming from the barbaric north. Their clothes were simple, their habits considered coarse, and above all, their devotion to Huitzilopochtli with its intense rituals caused fear and repulsion. The history of the Mexica in the valley is a long and humiliating chapter of rejection. They asked for shelter and were expelled. They offered their services as warriors and were used as disposable mercenaries, the front line in the wars of others. In one of the best-known episodes of this pilgrimage, they arrived in the lands of Culhuacan. Their chief, seeing the desperation of the people, allowed them to settle in Tizapan, a region infested with snakes. He thought the snakes would kill them. To his astonishment, the Mexica not only survived, but made the snakes their dinner. But the culture clash came next. The Mexica asked for the daughter of the ruler of Culhuacan to be their goddess. The ruler, flattered, gave her his daughter. In the ceremony, however, the Mexica did what was customary for them. They sacrificed the girl to Huitzilopochtli, skinning her in his honor. When the ruler visited them, expecting to see her daughter as a queen, he saw a priest dressed in her skin. The fury was so great that the Mexica were massacred and driven out by arrows. It was a precarious existence, always on the margins, always at the mercy of others' tolerance. And yet, they continued. The prophecy had not been fulfilled. The sign of the eagle had not yet appeared. After so much rejection, the Mexica were pushed in the only direction no one wanted, the center of the lake. The fertile shores were someone else's property. For them, only the swampy sandbanks, the brackish marshes, and the small, uninhabited islands of Lake Texcoco remained. To any observer of the time, that place was the end of the line. It was a slow death sentence. The soil was muddy and unstable. The water was salty, unfit for drinking. There were no stones to build with, nor trees to make fire. How to plant? How to build shelters that wouldn't sink? It was the worst possible territory. But the Mexica had something their neighbors didn't expect: an absolute need to survive and the memory of a people who had learned to live on the water, perhaps in Aztlán. They looked at that hostile swamp and saw not an aquatic desert, but a raw material. Lesson 1. There was no fresh water. They observed the current and identified the points where the lighter spring waters from the mountains flowed over the surface of the salt lake. They built simple dikes to separate and capture this water. Lesson 2. There was no firm ground to plant on. They invented Chinampas. Imagine the scene. Dozens of men driving stakes into the muddy bottom of the lake, intertwining poles to form a large rectangular basket. Then they filled this basket with layers of fertile mud dredged from the bottom, algae and decaying vegetation. Over time, the roots of the trees they planted on the edges, the ahuetes, consolidated that structure, transforming water into fertile, irrigated land. What was once nothing began to produce corn, beans, peppers, and tomatoes, one harvest after another, in soil that renewed itself with the lake's own mud. Simple adobe and wood houses began to appear. Canals were opened, transforming the nascent city into an American Venice. Small canoes carved from tree trunks replaced the roads. The mud, once an obstacle, became the foundation. Slowly, island by island, platform by platform, a new world emerged from the waters. And then, the moment their bones and souls had awaited for generations finally arrived. It was the year 1325. The codices recount that a group of priests, led by Tenoch, the chief who would give his name to the city, were performing rituals on one of the small rocky islands in the lake. At dawn, one of them looked up at an irregular rock emerging from the calm waters. And there it was. On the rock, a nopal cactus had miraculously sprouted in a crevice, and on the cactus, a golden eagle was perched. In its talons, it held a serpent, and its wings were folded, as if to say, "I have arrived. This is my place." The morning sun must have bathed the scene, creating a halo of light around the bird. The sight must have paralyzed the priests. It was not just a bird. It was the materialization of a centuries-old prophecy. It was Huitzilopochtli's voice falling silent because the journey had ended. There, at that improbable spot, on that piece of rock and water that nobody wanted, they founded their city. They called it Mexico-Tenochtitlán, Mexico in honor of the god Mexi, another name for Huitzilopochtli, and Tenochtitlán in honor of Tenoch, or perhaps derived from Tet, stone, and Nochtli, tuna, the fruit of the cactus, the place of the stone tuna. In the beginning, it was nothing more than a handful of straw huts, an improvised altar for the god. Nothing, absolutely nothing in that scene suggested the grandeur that was to come. But something fundamental had changed in the spirit of that people. For the first time in centuries, the Mexica were no longer on the move. They had a home conquered by faith and perseverance. They had found the place sought for generations. But think of the irony, the audacity of it. Among all the fertile lands of the valley, among the verdant valleys and powerful cities, they planted their flag exactly where no one else dared to tread, an inhospitable island in a salt lake. For any people of that time, that would be a beginner's mistake, a sentence to oblivion. For the Mexica, it was the beginning of a transformation. Because in the following decades, that handful of huts on the mud would begin to grow, to expand, to become vertical. The canals would become aquatic avenues where thousands of canoes would glide. The Chinampas would multiply, forming a green belt capable of feeding a population that would explode. And in the center of it all, a great pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc would begin to emerge, projecting its shadow over the waters. The world would discover with astonishment that this rejected, wandering, landless people was about to build a city so grand, so dazzling, that when the European conquerors saw it 200 years later, they would swear they were witnessing a dream. But before it became the center of an empire that would dominate Mesoamerica, before Hernán Cortés was left speechless with its grandeur, Tenochtitlan would still need to survive its first winters. Because in the Valley of Mexico, power was not an inherited right. It was not a promise. It was something that was conquered, with mud, with sweat, and with blood.